He didn't panic when the engine failed. He didn't panic when the radio went silent. He only panicked weeks later, when he realized no one was coming. This is not a story about bravery. It's about what happens when survival turns into waiting. He arrived in the Arctic with a schedule. That was the first thing that would later feel unreal. The plan was simple, written weeks in advance, and approved by people far away from this place. A short supply run, a routine inspection, a few days at most, then back south, back to movement, noise, and time that behaved normally. Nothing about the plan accounted for silence. The landing strip was nothing more than a flattened stretch of frozen ground, marked by weathered poles half buried in snow. When the small aircraft touched down, the sound of the engine echoed across the white emptiness and then disappeared, swallowed instantly by the open land. No trees, no buildings, no movement, just flat ice and sky blending into one colorless horizon. He stepped out wearing layers he believed were enough. At the time, the cold felt sharp but manageable. It bit at exposed skin, forcing his breath to slow, but did not yet feel threatening. Cold, in his mind, was still something temporary, something you endured, not something that changed you. The pilot did not stay long. There was a brief exchange of words, mostly procedural. The kind of conversation people have when both sides assume everything will go according to plan. The engine started again. The aircraft turned slowly, lifted, and vanished into the sky. The sound faded. Then there was nothing. The silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in, replacing the noise piece by piece until even his own movements sounded foreign. Every step across the packed snow felt louder than it should have been. Every breath echoed inside his hood. He stood still longer than necessary, listening. Nothing answered. The structure he was assigned to was visible in the distance, a low, utilitarian building designed to withstand wind and cold, not time. It had been there for years, used seasonally, maintained just enough to remain functional. From afar, it looked solid. From up close, it looked tired. Inside, the air was stale but calm. The generator hummed quietly, reassuring in its steadiness. Supplies were stacked where they were supposed to be. Fuel levels matched the logs. Everything suggested this would be routine. That reassurance would not last. He unpacked slowly, methodically, moving with the confidence of someone who believed the environment was harsh but predictable. Food was inventoried, equipment checked, tools laid out in an orderly fashion. The radio sat on the table where it always sat, silent for now, but ready. Outside, daylight stretched on without change. There was no clear beginning or end to the day here. The sun hovered low, sliding sideways rather than rising or setting. Time felt stretched thin, like it had been pulled too far without breaking. That was when the first small mistake happened. It was nothing dramatic. No loud noise. No visible damage. Just a skipped step. A decision made quickly because it seemed unnecessary to do otherwise. He noticed a minor fluctuation in the generator output, small enough to ignore, common enough to assume it would stabilize on its own. He wrote it down and moved on. The cold deepened as hours passed. Inside the structure, warmth held steady, but outside the wind picked up, carving soundless paths across the snow. He stepped out briefly to check a sensor line, and that was when he felt it. The cold was no longer sharp. It was heavy. It pressed rather than cut. He stayed outside longer than planned, focused on the task, not noticing how stiff his fingers had become until he tried to adjust a latch and felt nothing at all. No pain, just absence. That unsettled him more than pain would have. Back inside, he removed his gloves slowly, watching color return to his hands. He laughed once, quietly, at himself. People often laughed in situations like this, a reflex, a way to remind themselves they were still in control. The radio crackled briefly that evening. Static, broken words, nothing clear enough to respond to. He logged it anyway. Communication in remote regions was unreliable. That was not unusual. He prepared a simple meal, ate without much thought, and sat near the window, watching the sky drift sideways. There was no feeling of danger yet, just isolation. Isolation, at this stage, felt clean. The night did not arrive so much as it thickened. The light dimmed, but darkness never fully took over. He slept in short intervals, waking often, unsure how much time had passed. Each time he opened his eyes, the room looked the same. Morning, when it came, was indistinguishable from the night before. On the second day, the wind intensified, not violently, but persistently. It moved around the structure, probing seams and edges, testing for weaknesses. The sound it made was low and constant, like breath moving through a narrow space. He ran through the checklist again. Generator steady, fuel stable, food sufficient, radio quiet. That was when he noticed the temperature reading. It had dropped more than expected, still within survivable range, still within what the structure was designed for. But the drop was faster than the forecast had suggested. Weather in this region often ignored forecasts, but the speed of the change stood out. He adjusted the interior settings, compensated, and told himself it would level out. It did not. By the third day, time had begun to lose shape. Tasks repeated themselves more quickly than they should have, or perhaps more slowly. It was hard to tell. Without sunrise or sunset, his body relied on routine rather than light. He cleaned equipment that was already clean, rechecked supplies he had already counted, wrote notes longer than necessary. The radio remained silent. Late that day, he stepped outside again, this time only for a moment. The cold wrapped around him instantly, no longer feeling external. It felt invasive, like something that entered the body rather than touched it. He returned inside with a sense of urgency he could not fully explain. That night, the generator stuttered. Just once, a brief hesitation, barely noticeable. The lights flickered and returned to normal. The sound resumed its steady hum. He froze, listening. When nothing else happened, he told himself it was fine. But he did not sleep. On the fourth day, the engine stuttered again. Longer this time. Long enough for the silence to return. Thick, absolute, overwhelming. Then the hum came back. He logged the incident, adjusted settings, checked connections. Everything appeared intact. There was no obvious failure, no visible damage, no clear cause. That uncertainty lingered. By now, the radio had been silent for days. The scheduled check-in window passed without response. He tried again later. Still nothing. At this point, protocol suggested waiting. And so he waited. Waiting in the Arctic is not passive. It is an action that consumes time, energy, and thought. Each hour spent waiting felt heavier than the last. Each decision to stay closed the door on other possibilities. Outside, the world remained unchanged. Endless white, endless quiet. No sign that time was moving forward at all. Inside, the generator hummed. For now, he sat at the table, hands wrapped around a warm mug, staring at the radio as if it might speak on its own. This was still not fear. It was something quieter, a growing awareness that the margin for error here was thinner than he had believed, and that the smallest problems had a way of growing in places where nothing else changed. He did not yet know how long he would stay. He still believed someone would come, and that belief, more than the cold, was what kept him calm. For now, the radio was still silent when he woke. He noticed it immediately, not because he expected to hear something, but because the absence had started to feel deliberate. Silence was no longer a background condition. It had become a presence. He checked the clock. The numbers meant very little now. Without sunrise or sunset to anchor the day, time existed only as a sequence of tasks. Wake, eat, check systems, write notes, sleep, repeat. The clock was supposed to keep order, but it only reminded him how arbitrary that order had become. He turned the radio on again and adjusted the frequency, slower this time. Each movement was careful, as if sudden motion might somehow disrupt something fragile. Static answered him, low, uneven, empty. No voices. He tried the emergency channel. Nothing. This was the point where protocol mattered. He knew that. The procedures had been explained clearly during training and reinforced in briefings. If communication failed for a set period of time, certain assumptions were made. Certain actions were taken. But protocol also assumed predictability, predictable weather, predictable response times, predictable rescue windows. None of that applied here. He wrote in the logbook, describing the continued communication failure in neutral language. The words were precise, factual, almost detached. Writing like that made the situation feel manageable. As long as it could be described cleanly, it felt contained. Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. The cold pressed in without resistance, filling the space where sound used to be. He stepped out briefly to check the antenna, moving slower now, aware of how quickly sensation vanished in his fingers. The equipment was intact. No visible damage. No loose connections. No obvious explanation. Back inside, the generator hummed steadily again, as if the earlier stutters had never happened. The warmth it provided felt more valuable now. Less like comfort, more like a barrier. He stood near it longer than necessary, listening to its rhythm. That was when the thought surfaced, quiet, rational, almost comforting. Waiting is safer. It made sense. Moving in this environment without reliable communication increased risk. Attempting travel without confirmation of rescue could turn a manageable situation into a fatal one. The structure offered shelter. Supplies were sufficient for now. The generator was functioning. Waiting was the logical choice. He wrote that down too. The day passed without event, or rather, without any event he could identify as meaningful. The lack of change itself began to feel like a form of pressure. The environment offered no feedback, no reassurance, no warning. Just continuity. By what he believed was evening, the temperature dropped again. Not sharply, gradually, enough to notice. He adjusted interior settings once more, compensating, watching the number stabilize. Still within acceptable limits. Still survivable. He ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. Hunger had become a distant signal, something to be acknowledged but not felt. He noticed that he was chewing more slowly, as if his body were conserving effort, even in small ways. Sleep came in fragments. He dreamed of movement, vehicles passing, voices overlapping, sounds stacking on top of one another until they became noise again. When he woke, the quiet felt heavier than before. On the next cycle, he hesitated to call it a day. He attempted communication again. This time, he spoke longer, clearly stating his location, condition, and status. He repeated the message twice, then waited. Nothing answered. That was when doubt entered. Not fear, doubt. He began to question whether the messages were going out at all, whether the antenna alignment was correct, whether the issue was mechanical, atmospheric, or something else entirely. He ran diagnostics again, slower this time, checking each component with deliberate attention. Everything reported normal. The mismatch between what the instruments said and what he was experiencing created a quiet tension. Systems insisted things were fine. Reality suggested otherwise. He sat down and reviewed the supply inventory again. There was enough food, enough fuel, enough time, at least on paper. Time, however, was behaving strangely. Moments stretched, actions repeated. He caught himself staring at the wall longer than intended, his thoughts drifting without direction. When he returned to the logbook, he had to check the last entry to remember what he had already written. That unsettled him more than the cold. He made an effort to create structure, scheduled tasks, fixed meal times, equipment checks at regular intervals. Routine was supposed to protect the mind. Instead, it highlighted how little variation existed. At some point, he noticed that he had begun speaking aloud while working. Not full sentences at first, just acknowledgments, confirmations, fragments of thought. It felt natural. Talking filled the space where sound should have been. He had not stopped himself. Later, the generator faltered again. This time, the pause was longer. The lights dimmed noticeably. The hum dropped in pitch, then stopped entirely. Silence rushed in. Not just quiet. Silence so complete it felt physical, pressing against his ears. He stood frozen, listening to his own breathing, aware of how loud it sounded in the absence of everything else. Then the generator restarted. The hum returned, uneven at first, then steady. He exhaled slowly, only then realizing he had been holding his breath. This incident could not be ignored. He opened a maintenance panel and checked the internal components, hands moving automatically. There was no clear fault, no obvious damage, no reason for the interruption. Uncertainty began to replace confidence. He noted the time, or what he believed was the time, and logged the event. His handwriting looked slightly different than it had earlier. Tighter, more deliberate. That night, he did not attempt to sleep right away. He stayed awake, listening, alert for changes in sound or vibration. When he eventually lay down, rest came shallow and brief. The following cycle brought no improvement. Communication remained silent. The temperature continued its gradual descent. The generator held, but only barely, its occasional hesitations now expected rather than surprising. Waiting no longer felt like a choice. It felt like inertia. He considered alternatives. Leaving the structure on foot was not realistic. The distances involved were vast, the terrain unforgiving, the weather unpredictable. Without confirmed rescue coordinates, movement increased exposure without guaranteeing safety. Staying meant relying on systems that were showing signs of instability. Both options carried risk. He chose the one that felt less immediate. He stayed. The decision was not dramatic. There was no moment of resolve, no clear turning point. It was simply the absence of action, the continuation of what he was already doing. That, in retrospect, would matter. As the days blended together, small changes became more noticeable. The interior felt colder, even when the temperature readings suggested otherwise. His hands took longer to warm after brief exposure. His thoughts felt slower, requiring more effort to organize. He caught himself rereading the same line in the logbook multiple times without absorbing it. Outside, the landscape remained unchanged. No tracks, no movement, no indication that anything beyond the structure existed at all. The radio sat untouched for longer stretches now. He still tried it, but with less expectation. Each unanswered call reinforced the sense that communication was no longer part of this environment. He adjusted his language when speaking aloud. The tone became quieter, more measured, as if volume itself were inappropriate here. One evening, or what he believed was evening, he noticed something strange. The generator sounded different. Not failing, not stopping, just different. A subtle change in rhythm, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch his attention. He stood close to it, listening, trying to identify the difference. It did not resolve. That night, sleep did not come at all. He lay awake, staring into the dim light, counting breaths, counting seconds, trying to anchor himself to something measurable. Time slipped anyway, stretching and compressing without warning. At some point, exhaustion overtook him. When he woke, he was disoriented. For several seconds, he did not know where he was or why he was there. The realization came slowly, settling back in a place like a heavy object returning to rest. He checked the radio again. Still nothing. By now, waiting no longer felt safe, but it felt inevitable. He had crossed an invisible threshold, one defined not by danger, but by dependence. Dependence on a structure, on the generator, on systems that were not designed for indefinite use. The Arctic had not attacked him. It had simply removed alternatives. And in doing so, it had quietly begun to narrow the future down to a single point, one where survival depended less on action and more on endurance. He did not yet know how long he would wait, but he was beginning to understand that waiting itself would become the real challenge. Time did not disappear all at once. It thinned. The hours lost their edges first. What had once been distinct blocks of activity, waking, eating, checking systems, resting, began to bleed into one another, without sunrise or sunset to separate them. One period slid into the next until the sequence itself felt optional. He still followed the routine, or what remained of it. He woke when his body allowed him to. He ate when hunger became noticeable rather than scheduled. He checked the generator more often now, sometimes without remembering why he had gone to it in the first place. Each action was familiar, but the reason behind it felt increasingly distant. The clock continued to function. He stopped trusting it. Numbers changed, but they no longer anchored experience. He would look at the display, acknowledge it, then forget it moments later. Time here is no longer something you moved through. It was something that sat around you, heavy and unmoving. The structure felt smaller. Not physically, its dimensions had not changed, but perceptually. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. Sounds echoed more sharply, as if the space itself were tightening. He became aware of every creak, every vibration, every shift in temperature. Especially the temperature. The cold outside had reached a level that no longer registered a sensation. It was no longer painful. Pain implied response. This cold existed without asking anything in return. It simply occupied space. Inside, warmth was relative. He layered clothing even while indoors, noticing that his body no longer generated heat the way it once had. Movement required more effort. Small tasks left him winded. His hands stiffened faster, fingers losing precision after only brief exposure. He began to drop things. Not often at first. A tool slipping from his grip, a utensil clattering onto the table. Each incident felt minor, but together they suggested something larger, a loss of fine control that had not been there before. He wrote less in the logbook. The entries became shorter, more factual. Sometimes he would pause mid-sentence, stare at the page, then finish the thought several lines later, unsure how much time had passed between words. Reading older entries felt strange. They were clearly written by him, but they did not feel recent. Some seemed distant, as if recorded by someone else entirely. The radio remained silent. He no longer expected otherwise. At some point, he could not identify when he stopped speaking aloud as much. Words felt unnecessary. Thoughts occurred without needing to be externalized. Silence, once oppressive, had become the default state. The generator hummed. It was the only sound that never left. He began to notice patterns in it, variations in pitch that repeated, subtle shifts that formed rhythms. He listened to it more than he listened to anything else. Sometimes he found himself timing his breathing to it, unconsciously syncing his body to the machine. When the generator hesitated now, even briefly, the reaction was immediate. His body tensed before his mind registered the change. Heart rate spiked, breath shortened. Silence, even for seconds, felt dangerous. He adjusted his sleeping area closer to the generator, not for warmth, but for reassurance. The sound anchored him. As long as it continued, something in the world was still functioning. Sleep became irregular. He drifted in and out, often waking with the sense that something had changed, only to find everything exactly as it had been. Dreams blended with waking thoughts. He sometimes questioned whether he had completed certain tasks or only imagined doing so. Once, he woke convinced that someone had spoken to him. The realization that no one else was there came slowly, accompanied not by fear, but by disappointment. That reaction concerned him. He tried to reintroduce structure, set alarms, create artificial markers for day and night. It helped briefly, then stopped helping at all. The alarms felt arbitrary, detached from any natural rhythm. Time resisted being organized. Food consumption slowed, not by design. He simply forgot to eat. Hunger arrived later, less urgently. When it did, it felt dull rather than sharp, easily ignored until weakness forced his attention. He lost weight without noticing. Clothing fit differently. Layers that had once felt snug now hung looser. He tightened straps, adjusted belts, adapted without acknowledging what the changes implied. Movement outside became rare. Each time he opened the door, the cold entered immediately, forceful and absolute. The contrast was startling, draining energy almost instantly. Tasks that once took minutes now required planning and recovery. He limited exposure. The world beyond the structure became something observed through small windows rather than experienced directly. The horizon never changed. The sky never offered cues. There was no indication of progress, no sign that anything beyond his immediate surroundings existed. The Arctic had reduced itself to a static image. Inside, The air felt thicker, not warmer, just heavier. Breathing required more conscious effort. He noticed condensation forming more frequently, moisture freezing in thin layers along edges and corners. He wiped them away, aware that the buildup suggested declining efficiency. The generator's rhythm shifted again, not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable. A slightly longer pause between cycles, a deeper vibration, nothing that triggered alarms, but enough to draw attention. He monitored it closely, checking readings multiple times per cycle, even when the numbers remained within acceptable ranges. His trust in instruments had eroded. Experience now carried more weight than data. Experience told him things were narrowing. He attempted communication again. This time, his message was shorter, less formal. He stated his condition, his location, and the duration of the outage as best he could estimate. His voice sounded unfamiliar to him, flatter, slower, as if filtered through something. He waited. Nothing answered. The lack of response no longer surprised him. It simply confirmed what he had already accepted. He was no longer part of any active system. Whatever processes existed beyond this place were continuing without him. That realization marked another shift. He stopped marking time in days. Instead, he counted generator cycles, fuel checks, meals consumed, physical sensations. These became the new units of measurement, more reliable than hours or dates. Cold became constant. It no longer announced itself. It did not fluctuate. It existed as a baseline condition, shaping every movement, every thought. He adapted, but adaptation required energy, and energy was increasingly limited. He noticed tremors in his hands when he tried to perform precise tasks. Small, involuntary movements that made delicate adjustments difficult. He compensated by moving slower, bracing tools, simplifying actions. Everything took longer. Fatigue accumulated. Not the kind that sleep resolves, but a deeper exhaustion that settled into muscles and bones. Rest provided diminishing returns. Each period of inactivity left him feeling no more restored than before. He spent longer periods sitting. At first, this was deliberate, conserving energy. Later, it happened without conscious decision. He would sit down intending to rest briefly, then realize much later that he had not moved. Thoughts drifted. They no longer followed linear paths. Memories surfaced without context, disconnected from the present. He recalled sounds vividly, traffic, voices, doors closing, sensations that felt impossibly distant now. Sometimes he replayed conversations he had never had, filling silence with imagined exchanges. He recognized this as a warning sign. Awareness did not stop it. The generator faltered again. This time, the pause was long enough for the interior temperature to drop noticeably. The lights dimmed, flickered, then stabilized. The restart was rough, uneven, like a machine waking reluctantly. He stood very still until the sound normalized. Afterward, he checked the fuel levels again. They were lower than expected. Not critically low, but trending downward faster than the log suggested they should. Efficiency was declining. That meant time was shorter than he had calculated. He revised estimates, adjusted projections. The numbers shifted uncomfortably. What had once felt like sufficient margin now looked narrow, even optimistic. Waiting, which had once seemed safe, now felt like erosion. He considered action again. Leaving was still unrealistic. Weather conditions outside remained hostile. Without clear destination or confirmed rescue, movement increased exposure without improving odds. Staying meant watching resources drain. Both paths converged on the same uncertainty. He chose to stay again. The choice no longer felt like strategy. It felt like default. The Arctic continued its work. It did not attack. It did not threaten. It simply remained unchanged, indifferent to his presence, unmoved by his efforts to impose order or meaning. Time, as he had known it, no longer existed here. There was only sequence. The sequence of checks, the sequence of breaths, the sequence of generator cycles that marked the continuation of life. He adapted to that reality. Adaptation did not feel heroic. It felt quiet. By the end of this phase, though he would not have used those words, he had stopped asking when help would come. The question itself felt irrelevant. The future had collapsed into a narrow corridor defined by immediate needs. Warmth, fuel, function. Everything else had fallen away. He did not know how many cycles had passed. He only knew that time was no longer moving forward. It was simply happening. The change was subtle enough that he did not notice it at first. There was no clear moment when thoughts separated from reality. No sudden confusion. No dramatic break. The shift arrived quietly, disguised as adaptation. He continued his routine. He still checked the generator, still monitored fuel levels, still logged observations, though less frequently. From the outside, his behavior might have appeared stable. Internally, something had begun to loosen. He noticed it in his thinking first. Simple decisions took longer. He would consider multiple options, discard them, then return to the original choice without remembering why he had rejected it. The loop felt logical while it happened. Only afterward did it feel unnecessary. Language began to thin. When he spoke aloud, which he did again, occasionally, sentences shortened. Thoughts were expressed in fragments rather than complete ideas. He noticed himself stopping mid-sentence, as if the conclusion no longer mattered. That did not alarm him. Alarm required clarity. The generator's sound remained constant, but his perception of it changed. Sometimes it felt closer, louder, more insistent. At other times it seemed distant, muted, as if the structure itself were absorbing it. Once he was certain it stopped. He stood up immediately, heart racing, breath shallow, scanning for silence. The hum was still there. The realization that the sound had never changed unsettled him more than an actual failure would have. He began to mistrust his senses. Vision blurred occasionally, especially when he stood too quickly. Peripheral movement caught his attention, shadows shifting where nothing existed. He turned often, expecting to see something, only to find the same static interior. His eyes lingered longer than necessary on doorways and corners. He slept less, not because he chose to, but because rest no longer brought separation. Sleep felt too similar to waking. The same darkness, the same stillness, the same hum in the background. When he closed his eyes, thoughts continued uninterrupted. Sometimes he did not know whether he had slept at all. Memory began to rearrange itself. Events from earlier cycles surfaced out of order. He remembered tasks completed, but could not recall when. He found tools placed where he did not remember leaving them. He checked the logbook repeatedly, not for information, but to confirm that he had done something. Proof of action had become necessary. The temperature dropped again. He adjusted the settings, but the interior no longer felt warm even when readings suggested it should. Cold had penetrated deeper than skin. It had settled into joints, muscles, thoughts. Movement required intention. He noticed that he had begun conserving words the same way he conserved energy. Only essential thoughts were allowed to surface. Everything else dissolved before forming fully. The radio sat unused for longer stretches now. Not because he had given up, but because the act of speaking into it felt performative. Repeating the same message into silence no longer felt productive. Silence did not feel like absence anymore. It felt like a response. One cycle, or what he believed was one. He thought he heard a sound from outside. Not wind, not structural movement. A distinct, rhythmic noise. He froze, listening. The sound did not repeat. He waited longer than necessary, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the door. When nothing else happened, he told himself it had been imagination, a misinterpretation of familiar noises. Still, he did not move for several minutes. Later, he could not remember why he had been standing there. The first clear hallucination came quietly. He was sitting at the table, reviewing fuel calculations, when he became aware of another presence in the room. Not visually, there was nothing to see, but spatially, a sense that someone was standing just outside his line of sight. The sensation was unmistakable. He turned slowly. The room was empty. The feeling faded almost immediately, leaving behind a dull unease rather than fear. He dismissed it, attributing it to fatigue, isolation, cold. He did not write it down. Writing it down would have made it real. Decision-making became inconsistent. He adjusted generator settings, then adjusted them back, unsure which configuration was correct. He second-guessed maintenance checks he had performed moments earlier. Each choice felt provisional, subject to revision. Confidence eroded, not in dramatic collapse, but through accumulation. Small doubts stacked on top of one another until certainty became rare. He began to rely on instinct. Instinct, however, was no longer calibrated. His body sent conflicting signals. Hunger appeared late. Fatigue arrived unpredictably. Cold felt constant regardless of conditions. Pain dulled, then sharpened without warning. Once, he cut his finger slightly while handling equipment. He did not feel it happen. He noticed the blood later, dark against pale skin, and stared at it longer than necessary, trying to remember when the injury had occurred. The delay disturbed him. He treated it carefully, methodically, aware that small injuries could become serious here. The generator faltered again. This time, the pause lasted long enough for him to count several breaths. When it restarted, he laughed. The sound surprised him. It was short, sharp, out of place. The kind of laugh that comes not from humor, but from release. He stopped himself quickly, embarrassed despite being alone. Embarrassment implied an audience. He wondered, briefly, whether anyone would ever read the logbook. The thought lingered longer than it should have. As resources declined, calculations became more frequent. He revised estimates repeatedly, sometimes arriving at different conclusions using the same numbers. This inconsistency frustrated him. Numbers were supposed to be stable. When they were not, it felt personal. He began to experience brief moments of detachment, periods where he observed himself acting as if from a slight distance. He watched his hands move, his body respond, his voice speak, without fully inhabiting the actions. These moments passed quickly, but they left behind a residue, a sense that he was not entirely aligned with himself. One night, he was certain he heard the radio crackle. He sat up instantly, heart racing, listening intently. Silence. He reached for the device, fingers trembling slightly, and adjusted the controls. Static responded, familiar and empty. The disappointment that followed was sharp, sharper than he expected. He sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the radio, imagining what a voice would sound like now. Would it feel intrusive, comforting, unreal? He realized he could no longer answer that question. The environment continued its work. Cold reduced dexterity. Fatigue slowed reaction. Isolation altered perception. None of these factors acted alone. Together, they reshaped cognition. He began to make assumptions without verifying them. Once, he believed he had completed a maintenance task, only to discover later that he had skipped a critical step. Another time, he assumed fuel levels were stable because they had been the last time he checked, neglecting to confirm. Errors accumulated. He corrected them when he noticed, but the fact that they occurred at all signaled a deeper problem. Awareness fluctuated. Some moments brought sharp clarity. He recognized his condition, acknowledged the risks, understood the trajectory. In those moments, urgency surfaced. Then clarity faded. Urgency dissolved into inertia. He delayed decisions that required effort, postponed actions that felt optional. Each delay felt reasonable at the time. Later, he could not remember why he had waited. The structure felt increasingly unfamiliar. He noticed details he had overlooked before, scratches, stains, marks whose origins he could not place. The space felt used, lived in by someone else. He wondered briefly who had been here before him, how long they had stayed, what they had thought. That line of thought ended abruptly. Speculation felt dangerous. He experienced another hallucination shortly after. This time it was auditory. A voice. Not words, just a tone, distant and indistinct, as if carried through layers of interference. He could not identify its source or content. It lasted only a few seconds, then vanished. He did not move. He did not react. He waited for it to return. It did not. He acknowledged the event internally, categorized it as a symptom, and moved on. Reaction required energy. Panic served no function. That calm response worried him. It suggested adaptation rather than resistance. He checked the generator again. Fuel levels had dropped further than expected. He recalculated. The margin was narrowing faster than before. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine the generator stopping permanently. Not as a hypothetical, but as a future event. The thought did not trigger panic. It felt distant, abstract, like a scenario belonging to someone else. That emotional detachment frightened him more than fear would have. He attempted to force urgency, made lists, set priorities, repeated to himself what needed to be done. The words felt hollow. Motivation did not follow instruction. The mind, altered by isolation and cold, resisted pressure. He noticed that he had begun simplifying his world. Fewer tasks, fewer decisions, fewer variables. Complexity felt overwhelming. Simplicity felt manageable. Survival had narrowed to a small set of functions. Maintain warmth, maintain power, remain conscious. Everything else faded. He stopped imagining rescue. Not consciously. He did not tell himself it would not happen. The idea simply stopped appearing in his thoughts. The future no longer contained external intervention. There was only continuation. He still checked the radio occasionally, but without expectation. The act was ritual rather than hope. One evening, though the term had lost meaning, he sat listening to the generator and realized that he could no longer remember the sound of silence. Not true silence, the absence of sound, but the kind of quiet that exists alongside life. Background noise, distant movement, subtle variation. Silence here was absolute. It had overwritten his memory of anything else. The generator hesitated again. This time, when it resumed, he felt no relief. Only acknowledgement. The mind had shifted, not broken. Shifted. It had adapted to conditions that demanded endurance rather than action, acceptance rather than control. That adaptation kept him functional, but it also eroded the qualities that allowed him to assess danger accurately. He was still alive. He was still rational, mostly. But the line between perception and reality had thinned, and with it, the reliability of every decision he would make from this point forward. The Arctic had not defeated him. It had changed the way his mind worked, and that change would shape everything that followed. Hope did not arrive gently. It entered suddenly, without warning, and with it came a surge of energy he had not felt in a long time. The sound was faint at first, a low, irregular vibration that did not match the rhythm of the generator or the wind. It cut through the monotony just enough to stand out. He stopped what he was doing immediately, every sense alert. He listened. There was again. Distant, unclear, but undeniably different. His heart rate increased. Blood rushed back into limbs that had felt heavy for weeks. The effect was immediate and physical, as if his body had been waiting for permission to wake up. Aircraft. That was his first thought. Not certainty, not logic, just a word that surfaced fully formed, accompanied by images, movement, voices, arrival. He moved to the window, pressing closer than he had in days, scanning the horizon. The landscape looked unchanged, endless white under a muted sky. No visible shape, no movement. The sound faded. He waited, breath held, listening for it to return. It did not. He stood there longer than necessary, unwilling to move, afraid that any distraction might cause him to miss it. When nothing else happened, disappointment arrived slowly, tempered by rationalization. Sound carries strangely here, he told himself. It could have been anything. Still, the possibility had entered his mind, and once there, it refused to leave. Over the next cycles, he listened more closely. Every unfamiliar noise drew his attention. Every shift in the environment became a potential signal. His perception sharpened, but not evenly. Some details felt amplified, others faded entirely. He began to interpret coincidence as pattern. The radio crackled briefly one cycle later. Not enough to form words, just a burst of static that differed from the usual background noise. He reacted instantly, adjusting controls, speaking into the microphone with renewed urgency. Silence answered. but the crackle had been real. That mattered. He replayed the moment in his mind repeatedly, analyzing tone, duration, timing. Could it have been atmospheric interference, equipment fluctuation, or something external? Hope expanded to fill the gaps left by uncertainty. He spoke into the radio more often now, messages growing longer, more detailed. He included information he had previously omitted, imagining that clarity might increase the chance of response. Each transmission ended the same way, with silence. Still, he continued. Hope is resilient. It reinterprets failure as delay. The generator seemed steadier during this period, or perhaps he perceived it that way. Its rhythm felt more consistent, its pauses less frequent. The interior felt marginally warmer. Numbers stabilized. These changes were minor. He treated them as confirmation. He increased activity, moving more, preparing for arrival. He reorganized supplies, clearing space, ensuring access paths were unobstructed. His movements were faster now, less deliberate, fueled by anticipation. Fatigue retreated temporarily. Adrenaline compensated for depletion. He stepped outside more frequently, exposing himself to the cold despite the cost. Each time, he scanned the horizon longer, searching for any sign, smoke, shadow, motion. There was nothing, but the act itself mattered. It felt like participation rather than endurance. He began to imagine the moment of rescue in detail. Not emotionally, at least not at first, but procedurally. How they would approach, what they would say, what information he would provide. He rehearsed explanations aloud, refining them, preparing for questions that had not yet been asked. These rehearsals filled time. They also created expectation. Expectation is dangerous in isolation. The first real sign came during what he believed was a late cycle. Light shifted slightly, subtly, in a way he had not noticed in weeks. The sky brightened along one edge of the horizon, not enough to resemble sunrise, but enough to suggest change. He interpreted it immediately. Weather clearing. Clear weather meant flight windows. His thoughts accelerated, connecting unrelated observations into a coherent narrative. The sound, the radio crackle, the light, the stabilized generator. It all pointed in one direction. He prepared again, more thoroughly this time. Checked clothing, organized essentials, positioned himself closer to the door. Waiting became active. Then the generator hesitated. The pause was longer than it had been in days. The lights dimmed noticeably, casting long shadows across the interior. The hum dropped, faltered, then returned with a roughness that was new. He froze, watching the gauges. They recovered, but not fully. The change was small, but it contradicted the narrative he had constructed. Doubt surfaced. He suppressed it. Hope does not tolerate contradiction easily. The next cycle brought disappointment. No sound, no radio response, no further change in light. The sky returned to its familiar flatness. He waited longer than before, convinced that delay did not equal absence. He reminded himself that operations took time. Coordination required windows. Silence did not mean failure. He repeated these thoughts aloud, reinforcing them, shaping them into something solid enough to lean on. But as cycles passed without confirmation, hope began to strain. The emotional cost of anticipation became evident. Each unfulfilled expectation drained energy more rapidly than the cold had. His movements slowed again. His focus wavered. The contrast between imagined rescue and continued isolation widened, creating a tension that demanded resolution. He checked fuel levels again. They were lower than he remembered, significantly lower. He recalculated. The numbers did not align with his previous estimates. Consumption had increased during the period of heightened activity. Additional generator adjustments, increased interior heating, more frequent equipment use, all had exacted a cost. The margin was now critically narrow. Hope had accelerated depletion. That realization struck harder than the absence of rescue. He sat down abruptly, calculations spread before him, trying to reconcile expectation with reality. The two refused to align. The future he had been preparing for no longer fit the data in front of him. He felt anger for the first time in a long while. Not explosive, controlled, directed inward. He had allowed himself to believe. Belief had consequences. The radio crackled again, that same cycle. Short, indistinct, but unmistakable. He reacted instantly, speaking into it with urgency bordering on desperation. His voice sounded louder than intended, sharper, less controlled. Silence followed. This time, the disappointment was immediate and severe. He slammed his hand against the table, a sudden, uncharacteristic outburst that left him staring at the market made, breathing hard. Emotion surged, unfiltered. Hope collapsed into frustration, then into something closer to despair. He recognized the danger of this state. Emotional volatility increased the likelihood of error. Errors here were not abstract. They were cumulative, irreversible. He forced himself to stop, sat still, breathed slowly. It took longer than it should have. When calm returned, it felt thinner, less reliable. He reviewed the situation again, deliberately stripping away assumptions. The sounds could be environmental. The radio interference could be equipment-related. The light shift could be coincidence. None of it guaranteed rescue. The realization felt like loss. Not because rescue had been confirmed and then withdrawn, but because he had constructed a future that now had to be dismantled. He experienced a brief, intense urge to leave, to move, to do something decisive, regardless of risk. The urge passed, but its presence frightened him. It indicated how close he was to abandoning rational assessment in favor of action driven by emotion. That threshold was dangerous. He returned to waiting. But waiting had changed. It no longer felt neutral. It felt charged, burdened by the memory of expectation. Each moment carried the weight of what had almost been. His attention narrowed again. He reduced activity, conserving energy, undoing the acceleration hope had caused. Movements became deliberate once more. Speech diminished. Rehearsals ceased. He avoided the window. Looking outside, now, felt painful. The generator continued its uneven rhythm. Fuel continued to decline. Temperature continued its slow descent. Nothing else changed. The false hope left behind a residue. A sense of betrayal, not by the environment, but by his own mind. He had trusted perception shaped by need rather than evidence. That awareness brought caution, but also fatigue. Suppressing hope required effort. Effort consumed energy. He now faced a different challenge. Not merely surviving the environment, but surviving the psychological consequences of disappointment. The Arctic had offered him something rare and dangerous, the illusion of relief. And when that illusion faded, it left him more vulnerable than before. He would not make the same mistake again. Or at least, that is what he told himself. The days that followed did not feel longer because more happened. They felt longer because less did. After hope collapsed, time stretched in a different way. Each interval became heavier, slower to pass, resistant to movement. Effort did not advance anything. It only maintained the present. He reduced his world again. Tasks were stripped down to the essential minimum. Generator checks, fuel monitoring, basic nourishment, rest. Everything else was deferred indefinitely. Movement became economical. He noticed how carefully he now stood up, how deliberately he shifted his weight, how he paused after even small actions to let dizziness pass. The body had begun to impose limits of its own, independent of intention. Weakness arrived unevenly. Some moments brought clarity and strength. Others left him struggling to complete simple tasks. The fluctuations were unpredictable, eroding trust in his own capacity. Planning beyond the immediate future felt pointless. The cold no longer registered as temperature. It was pressure. It pressed inward, compressing joints, narrowing range of motion, demanding constant accommodation. Even inside, even layered, he could not escape it. Warmth existed only in degrees of less cold. He noticed numbness lingering longer. Hands took longer to regain sensation. Feet felt distant, as if separated from the rest of his body by a delay. He compensated by moving slower, by bracing himself, by simplifying movements further. Precision was gone. Energy conservation became instinctive. He ate smaller portions, not because food was scarce yet, but because digestion required effort. Heavy meals left him lethargic, unfocused. He favored simplicity, calories delivered with minimal processing. Hunger sharpened briefly, then dulled again. Weight loss accelerated. He could feel it in the way clothing hung, in the looseness of layers, in the subtle change of balance. His center of gravity felt different. He adjusted unconsciously. Sleep deteriorated further. Rest came in fragments, measured in minutes rather than hours. Dreams were shallow, repetitive, often indistinguishable from waking thought. He woke without feeling restored, but he woke. That was enough. The generator became unpredictable, not failing outright, but unreliable in small ways. Variations in output increased. Minor fluctuations appeared more frequently. Each required attention, adjustment, monitoring. Attention cost energy. He noticed that after each maintenance check, his hand shook slightly. The tremors subsided with rest, but they returned more quickly each time. The sound of the generator no longer reassured him. It demanded vigilance. Fuel calculations grew grim. What had once been a margin became a countdown. He revised estimates conservatively now, assuming worst-case efficiency. The numbers narrowed further. He stopped recalculating daily. The results did not change meaningfully. Revisiting them only amplified anxiety without improving outcomes. He committed the estimates to memory and moved on. The radio remained silent. He no longer spoke into it, not because he believed it useless, but because speech felt expensive. Words required breath, focus, articulation. Silence conserved energy. He thought less in sentences. Thoughts arrived as impressions, fragments, sensations. The effort required to structure them into language felt unnecessary. Isolation deepened. Not externally, that had been constant, but internally. He felt increasingly sealed within himself, cut off from not only other people, but from previous versions of his own identity. Memories lost context. He remembered places without sequence, conversations without voices, faces without names. These fragments surfaced briefly, then dissolved before he could examine them. He stopped trying to hold on to them. Holding on required effort. The longest days were marked not by events, but by persistence. He measured success differently now, not by progress, but by continuity. If the generator ran, if he remained conscious, if he could stand, those metrics were enough. He sat more, not from choice, but from necessity. Standing felt draining. Sitting conserved energy. Lying down felt risky, too close to surrender. He found a balance. Hours passed without activity. At first, this troubled him. Later, it became normal. Doing nothing conserved resources. Motion was no longer inherently beneficial. The structure felt colder. Moisture froze more quickly. Frost crept along seams, thickening despite his efforts to clear it. He wiped it away when necessary, but allowed it to accumulate elsewhere. Selective attention replaced comprehensive maintenance. Not everything could be preserved. Pain returned in unexpected ways. Joints ached deeply, especially after periods of inactivity. Muscles protested movement. He stretched cautiously, aware of how easily injury could occur now. Once he stumbled slightly. The recovery took longer than expected. His balance lagged behind intention. He steadied himself against the wall, breathing heavily, surprised by how close he had come to falling. Falls were dangerous. He moved more cautiously after that. Mental clarity fluctuated. Some periods brought sharp awareness. He recognized the severity of his condition, assessed options, acknowledged narrowing timelines. In those moments, fear surfaced briefly. Then it receded. Fear demanded energy. Detachment returned, smoothing emotional extremes. Concern existed, but muted, distant, manageable. He accepted that he might not feel panic, even if circumstances worsened. That acceptance was both stabilizing and alarming. He stopped tracking cycles altogether. There were no more mental markers, no attempt to label days. Time became a continuous field without divisions. Only change marked progression. And change was slow. The generator hesitated again. Longer this time. The lights dimmed enough to noticeably alter the interior. The hum dropped, stuttered, then returned unevenly. Recovery took longer. He waited until stability returned before moving. Afterward, he did not check the time. He checked the fuel. The level was lower. He adjusted consumption again, reducing interior heating slightly, tolerating increased cold to preserve function. The trade-off was calculated, deliberate. Comfort was no longer a factor. The cold deepened. He adapted. Adaptation now meant endurance rather than adjustment. There were fewer variables left to manage. The system had simplified itself through attrition. The Arctic remained unchanged. Outside, the horizon stayed flat. The sky remained indifferent. No sign of movement, no indication of rescue, no feedback at all. Inside, existence continued. He thought occasionally about what he would say if someone arrived. Not rehearsals anymore, just fragments, observations, facts. He wondered whether he would be able to speak at all. Speech felt distant. One cycle, or what he believed was one. He realized he had not stood up for a long time. Not minutes. Longer. He forced himself to move, stiffly, deliberately. Blood rushed back into limbs painfully. Dizziness followed. He waited it out, leaning against the table, breathing carefully. Standing felt like an accomplishment. That redefinition troubled him. He noted that he had begun congratulating himself for basic functions: standing, eating, checking equipment. The scale of achievement had shifted. Survival had narrowed to fundamentals. He accepted that narrowing. There was no alternative. The longest days were not dramatic. There were no sudden crises, no moments of revelation, no decisive turning points. They were defined by repetition, by persistence, by the quiet refusal to stop. Each breath was an act of continuation, each movement a decision to remain engaged, however minimally. He did not think about the future anymore. Not rescue, not failure, only the next requirement: warmth, fuel, awareness. Everything else was noise. The generator continued, uneven but functional. Fuel continued to decline. His body continued to weaken. Yet he remained. The Arctic did not hurry him. It allowed him to exist within narrowing margins, forcing adaptation without offering resolution. The longest days taught him something he did not articulate at the time. Survival was not an active struggle. It was endurance of monotony, of discomfort, of uncertainty without climax. He endured, not heroically, not dramatically, simply by continuing to occupy space, by continuing to breathe, by continuing to wait. The end did not announce itself. It arrived the way everything else had, quietly, without ceremony, without certainty that it was real. The sound came first, not sharp, not immediate, a low vibration that sat just beneath awareness, similar enough to the generator's rhythm that he did not react at once. He noticed it only because it did not fit. It was not internal. It was external. He sat very still, listening. The vibration returned, intermittent, uneven, separated by long pauses. It did not resemble wind. It did not resemble structural movement. It carried a pattern that felt intentional. He did not stand up immediately. Experience had taught him caution. False hope had consequences. He waited until the sound repeated again, closer this time, clearer. His heart rate increased, but he controlled his breathing, unwilling to let anticipation override judgment. When he finally stood, the effort was slow and deliberate. His legs protested, joints stiff, balance delayed. He steadied himself, listening as he moved. The sound persisted. He reached the window and looked out. At first, there was nothing. Then, movement. A distant shape, dark against the pale horizon, resolving gradually into something mechanical. It moved laterally rather than toward him, slow and steady, following a path that suggested navigation rather than chance. Aircraft. This time, the word did not surge forward. It settled. He watched without reacting, letting observation replace imagination. The shape grew slightly larger, then turned, adjusting its course. The sound intensified, separating itself fully from the generator's hum. This was not coincidence. He opened the door. Cold rushed in immediately, brutal and absolute, but he did not retreat. He stepped outside despite the cost, despite the weakness that made his movements unsteady. The aircraft passed overhead, low enough that he could see details. It did not land. It did not circle. It continued past. For several seconds, he remained still, watching it disappear. He did not shout. He did not wave. He waited. Then it turned. The sound changed, the pattern tightening, the movement purposeful now. It returned along a slightly altered path, lower than before. He felt something shift internally. Not relief, not excitement, recognition. This was happening. He activated the emergency beacon. The motion felt unfamiliar, as if performed by someone else. His hand shook, but the sequence was automatic, ingrained through training he had not thought about in a long time. The signal activated. He stood outside longer than was safe, ignoring the cold, focusing on the aircraft's movement as it slowed, descended, aligned. When it finally landed, the impact was muted by snow and distance. The sound faded quickly, leaving behind a different kind of quiet. Human movement. That was the next thing he noticed. Figures emerged, dark shapes against white, moving with purpose, closing the distance between the aircraft and the structure. Their movements looked efficient, practiced, unreal. He waited by the door. When they reached him, they did not speak at first. They looked at him, not in alarm, not in celebration, in assessment. He realized then how he must appear. Thin, slow, wrapped in layers that no longer fit correctly. His movements economical, constrained, as if conserving energy even now. Someone spoke. He did not understand the words at first. The sounds reached him, but meaning lagged behind. Language felt distant, like something he had not used in a long time. They repeated the question. He nodded. That seemed sufficient. Hands guided him gently, firmly, supporting without forcing. He followed, letting himself be moved, aware of how little resistance he offered. Inside the aircraft, warmth hit him abruptly. Not comfort, shock. His body reacted violently, shivering uncontrollably as systems that had been suppressed began to reactivate. He curled inward instinctively, breath coming in shallow bursts. They wrapped him in insulation, monitored him closely, spoke in low, calm voices. He caught fragments, duration, signal, delay, but they did not form a coherent narrative. He did not ask questions. Questions required orientation. He focused on breathing. The aircraft lifted. The movement felt unreal. When the ground fell away, he did not look down. Visual confirmation felt unnecessary. He trusted the sensation, the change in pressure, the shift in sound. Trust came easily now. Later, much later, he would be told how long he had been there. The number would surprise him. At the time, duration felt irrelevant. He slept deeply for the first time since arrival. When he woke, the environment had changed completely. Lights, voices, motion. The hum of machines layered on top of one another, overlapping rather than isolated. The density of sound overwhelmed him. He closed his eyes again, retreating inward until the noise softened. Recovery did not follow a clean trajectory. Physically, progress was measurable. Strength returned gradually. Sensation normalized. Weight stabilized. The body, given resources, remembered how to function. The mind was different. Time did not reassert itself immediately. Days passed without shape. He struggled to sequence events, to anchor memories in order. Conversations blurred together. Faces merged. Names slipped. Silence followed him. Not the external silence of the Arctic, but an internal quiet that dulled reaction. Emotional responses lagged behind events, arriving late or not at all. People asked how he felt. He answered accurately. Fine. Alive. Tired. These answers satisfied the questions. They did not capture the experience. He noticed that he spoke less. Not from fatigue, but from selectivity. Words felt heavy, imprecise. Silence felt easier. When he did speak, sentences were short, factual, stripped of interpretation. He avoided describing the isolation. Description required reconstruction. Reconstruction felt dangerous. Sleep improved, but dreams persisted. He dreamed of the generator most often, its hum, its pauses, the tension that accompanied every fluctuation. In these dreams, silence always followed, abrupt and total. He woke before resolution. Noise unsettled him. Crowds felt overwhelming. Movement without purpose irritated him. The constant presence of others felt intrusive, though he did not articulate this discomfort. He preferred stillness. Not Arctic stillness, controlled stillness. Time gradually returned its structure, but something remained altered. He noticed it in decision-making. He delayed choices longer than necessary, weighing options excessively. Urgency felt foreign. He struggled to prioritize tasks that did not directly affect survival. Trivial matters felt disproportionate. He had endured an environment where every decision carried consequence. Returning to a world where most choices did not felt disorienting. People celebrated his survival. He did not correct them. Survival felt like a technical outcome rather than a triumph. He had endured conditions that demanded it. He had not overcome them. He had adapted. Adaptation did not feel heroic. It felt quiet. Months later, when the experience was documented, timelines reconstructed, data analyzed, conclusions drawn, he read the reports with detached interest. They were accurate. They were incomplete. No report captured the weight of time without markers. The erosion of certainty. The way the mind simplifies itself under prolonged isolation. Those aspects resisted measurement. He returned once, briefly, to a cold environment. Not the same place. Not the same conditions. Just enough to test something. The cold registered immediately. The pressure returned. His body reacted faster than expected, recalling adjustments without instruction. His mind responded too. Clarity sharpened. Focus narrowed. The environment made sense. He left before adaptation progressed further. That frightened him. It suggested that something fundamental had changed, that part of him had learned to function better under constraint than freedom. He did not pursue that realization. Life resumed. Structure returned. Time moved forward again. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he noticed the absence of urgency. The way stillness no longer frightened him. The way monotony felt familiar rather than oppressive. Survival had recalibrated his internal scale. He did not romanticize the experience. He did not dramatize it. When asked what it was like, he chose his words carefully. It wasn't dangerous, he said once. It was narrowing. That answer confused people. He did not elaborate. The Arctic had not tested his strength. It had tested his tolerance for continuity without reward, effort without progress, time without reference. He had endured, not because he was exceptional, but because endurance, under the right conditions, becomes the only remaining function. And when nothing else is demanded, that function persists. The story did not end with rescue. It ended with adaptation. And adaptation, once learned, does not disappear.